as Provost. And it's really wonderful to have all of you here this afternoon to hear from some of our exceptional faculty about the work they're doing. Today's event is one of several events that President Paxton and I have been sponsoring over the course of this year. This year actually marked 5 years into Building on Distinction, the university's strategic plan. And we thought it would be really fun to use the various lectures that we organize, whether the presidential lecture series, the provost lecture series, different faculty by faculty lecture series, and try to actually sort of use them to highlight some of the incredible work that's taking place here at the university that very much reinforces what we're trying to do in this era of building on distinction. Over this last year, we've heard faculty discuss some of their research about the causes and effects of systemic racism, the urgency of climate change, efforts to understand the brain and address various disorders, and the role of memorialization in race relations in the U.S., just some of the topics that have been covered through these series. These are all critical issues that Brown is seeking to understand more deeply and confront more effectively through our distinctive approach to research and teaching, which is to blend together intellectual rigor with interdisciplinary inquiry. That's really what Building on Distinction is all about, and it's just so wonderful to see so much great work being done over the last several years. Today's talk is very much emblematic of this approach. We're going to be hearing from faculty members in the social, physical, and life sciences to discuss their China-related work. And our hope is that by offering these perspectives and points of view, we can sharpen and have a more nuanced understanding of the rise of China, whether it creates opportunities or perhaps challenges or some combination of both. Now, clearly, this is a very timely topic with China dominating the news in this country, whether it's around trade wars with the U.S. or China's domestic economy and its impact, some of the issues that the domestic economy are facing and the impact for the global economy, or issues of science domination with either 5G or Huawei. We hear a lot these days about China and its role in our society and our global economy. And today we'll be hearing from four really terrific faculty leaders on campus, Professors Jim Head, Ed Steinfeld, Rebecca Nedostup, and Tongzhang as our guides. And what we're hoping through the conversation that we'll have this afternoon is to actually get beyond the headlines and to be able to get a clearer sense of the kind of complexity of China today. What are the historical forces that have shaped contemporary landscape, and what are actually the prospects or even predictions for the future of China and its role in our global economy? Now, the panel members' biographies are in your program, so I'm not going to go through those today. I want to actually use time for substance. But instead, what we agreed to do was to ask each of our panelists to speak for about 5 minutes, just sort of to introduce their perspective on the rise of China. And then I'm going to sort of kick it off by asking them some questions and then open it up for general questions. We really want to make this as much of a conversation and a dialogue as possible. Now, if I can invite Professor Steinfeld and Nedostup and Zheng to please come up to the platform. Now, our Professor of Geological Sciences, please, you can go. Professor of Geological Sciences, Jim Head, is actually at a conference. He happens to be at the 50th Lunar and Planetary Science Conference at Houston, but he has graciously agreed to participate via Zoom. And so with that, why don't we begin by hearing from Jim.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm in Houston, as you mentioned, and indeed at the 50th Lunar and Planetary Science Conference. And believe it or not, my first job was on Apollo 11, and I've been to all 50 of these conferences. So we also ended up with another 15 to 20 faculty members and grad students here. We have 40 to 50 papers. It's really an exciting time. This past weekend, we had our Brown-Bernanke 60th Microsymposium, which had 215 attendees and a whole series of from 17 different nations as well. So it's really an exciting time in space. So if we have the first slide, I think it's really important to think a little bit about where space fits in. We've all heard the Star Trek mantra, space, the final frontier. Indeed, it is a major frontier. And one of the key points about space is that it's essentially a frontier in science, and technology, and organization. So we might have dreams about what we'd like to find out on other planets, but if we don't have the technology, we simply can't get there. And again, you can't just show up at Cape Kennedy with your experiment and expect there to be a launch vehicle sitting there waiting for you. The organizational structure that is involved in space exploration is critical. So these are really important things from the point of view of what countries can do in space. The second point is that it really does demonstrate national power. I grew up in Washington, D.C. In the 1940s and 50s, and believe me, when Sputnik 1 launched, fear took over because we had, in fact, a Soviet space station right over our head. On the other hand, Apollo 11, which I also worked on, was a completely different attitude, at least for us. There was worldwide awe. It was really a great demonstration of bringing the world together in a singular event, the first human to set foot on the moon. Now, indeed, in space provide also a variety of other things. Pride is how we view ourselves. Prestige is how others view us. These are both critically important in space on a national space program point of view. And indeed, it also inspires youth. This is exactly what happened to me. I went from thinking about going to an oil industry job immediately into the space field simply because I was so inspired by the idea of how we get to the moon, what do we do when we get there, and so on. Accomplishments in space, it's very important to understand that these are dual-use military-civilian technology. What this means for national leaders is it's a good investment because you not only get technology spin-off to go into the civilian industry, but it works the other way too. Anything you need to do to go to space, if you want to go to Pluto, trust me, you can't fly something that you would fly in a military satellite on the Earth. There's really advanced technology there. And that raises another question too. Cooperation in space often has these different aspects to it, which we have to be very careful from a national security point of view. Now, also, accomplishments in space enhance national security and provide vertical and horizontal, essentially, projections of power. It's really important, both up and across. And finally, accomplishments in space provide international leadership and national legitimacy. So, for example, the Soviet Union, when I was in Hungary during the Soviet era, everybody hated the Russians, but indeed the Russians launched in their Intercosmos program a Hungarian cosmonaut. And oh my gosh, everything was forgotten. Oh my gosh, we were all one. They were all one in terms of the wonderful pride that the Hungarians had in essentially flying a cosmonaut. So let's go to the next slide. I just briefly want to show you what is going on in terms of China program itself. The Chinese program is run by the Chinese National Space Agency. This is a series of logos which just shows the broad organization and the penetration of space into all sectors of the Chinese government and economy, etc. So Chinese Space Agency is very much like NASA headquarters. It's different than NASA as a whole because it doesn't have field centers. Those are really all the other symbols you see here, including on the left, the People's Liberation Army, which doesn't really work for the CNSA. The Chinese Academy of Sciences is much more like the Russian Academy of Sciences, and there's incredible leadership there in which people get a whole series of hundreds and hundreds of institutes behind the space exploration endeavor. Next, please. Now, the other part of it is that they have, in fact, robust industry. The China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, I love these names, the China Great Wall Industry Corporation. These people are, the CALT, et cetera, are making huge rockets. You see they're lined up next to one another, the Long March series. They are really competitive in the international launch market. They have had 300 successful launches of these vehicles, and they have a essentially Long March 5B, which is going to be essentially the same and even better perhaps than the SpaceX Falcon 9 heavy launch vehicle. So it's really competitive, and of course in the lower left-hand corner you can see that these are used to launch and build the Russian space station. The next slide shows the cosmonauts. They're known as the astronauts. They're known as taikonauts, if you will. These are really coming from Soviet, sorry, it's a long, Russian, like the Russian cosmonauts, these are coming from the military, and this is the same way that, in fact, the United States did, because these are test pilots. These are the people you send up first. It is under the People's Liberation Army. People say, oh, it's a military endeavor, etc. China turned to the PLA because of the organizational capabilities that PLA has, and they were the ones who, you want to have a really strong organization that has incredible organizational capabilities to actually pull these things off. So recently, in fact, the call for new cosmonauts, new taikonauts has gone out to the Academy of Sciences as well. So they're starting to recruit scientists, and you'll see why in a second. The next slide shows the space station that they're building. They're welcoming international partners on this. It's a very distinct tool of research, technology development, and international cooperation and participation, much like our space station is. And the next slide shows that the civilian space program, too, is really robust. Last year, we ended up sponsoring, with the help of the Watson Institute, Microsymposium 59, the Chinese Lunar and Deep Space Exploration Program. And this was amazing. We had over 30 Chinese scientists come, which we encouraged to come, and they came and talked all about their deep space exploration program, which includes not only the moon, but asteroids, Mars. There's a 2020 Mars mission just like ours, et cetera. Very, very robust program. And so the next slide, please, shows you, in fact, one of the keystones of this, which is the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program. This is amazing. This, if you look at this logo here of CLEP, the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program, and you see, in fact, in the lower right-hand part there, the symbol for the moon, and look at the logo, that is a stylized symbol of the moon, that blue, essentially, line, which encloses not just 2 bars, but 2 footprints. So this really tells you where China is going in this endeavor. And the next slide, please, shows you, in fact, one of the, this guy is amazing, Ouyang. He's the father of the Lunar Exploration Program, just an amazing man. And he was the one who first served as the chief scientist in the early parts in the 2000-2010 period. And his 3 graduate students are now running the program, literally running the program. And the next slide shows you they just landed on the far side of the moon. This is not a trivial exercise. You have to have a communication satellite in orbit. You have to be able to communicate with that, send commands down as it descends and lands, and then you have to have that to contact it as well. And we've helped them. I worked with them on the selection of this landing site, as with the next one. So later this year, they're going to launch a Long March 5 to actually return samples from the moon, bringing in a new era of lunar science. And this next slide here shows you how important this is. To return to the beginning, how important is this? Well, this is President Xi greeting the Changi 4 engineers and scientists at the Great Hall of the People just a couple of weeks ago, February 20th. Indeed, President Xi made these comments: "There is no end for space exploration." He called on science and technology workers and space engineers in China to ride on the wave of the Chang'e 4 mission to achieve the general goal of China's lunar project, make more efforts to push forward the international aerospace cause, and to bring more Chinese wisdom, solutions, and force to this peaceful use of space and the building of a community with a shared future for humanity. So I think, last slide, please. If you think about this, you can really realize that where is China going in space? I see this as a real Silk Road to space. All of these components China recognizes, and basically they see this as a really fundamental way to build self-respect, pride, and prestige. And trust me, they care less about what's going on at NASA or other organizations and more about where they're heading. So I hope this helps as an introduction. Thank you.
Jim, for those great comments. I'll begin with the proverbial self-criticism. 自我批评. 30 years ago, roughly 30 years ago, in 1989, when I was first living in China, had you asked me whether in my lifetime I would see a world-famous geologist and somebody who started his career at NASA describing a Chinese space program with admiration and talking about new-to-the-world things that the Chinese space program is doing, I would have said, no way, not in my lifetime. Had you told me that China would be the place with some of the world's most advanced transport systems, gleaming skyscrapers in a number of cities, a place where you could see first in the world commercialization of different AI solutions for industry, a place where you see some of the world's most advanced social media apps, some of the world's most advanced online payment systems, some of the most extensive penetration of broadband and use of smartphones. Had you described all that, I would have said, not in my lifetime, not in my children's lifetime, not in my grandchildren's lifetime, but here we are. And if people tell you that it's all about copying and there's nothing innovative going on in China, it's all fake or taken from somewhere else, don't believe them. Smart people in global business don't believe that, and they're trying to learn what's going on in China. At the same time, they're trying to protect their IP from theft that has occurred. But had you painted that picture to me of such modernity, ultra-modernity, I would have said, not a chance. And 10 years ago, had you said to me we would see a China in whatever, 10 or 20 years, run by a strong man who abolished term limits on party chairmanship, who's stoking ethno-nationalism, who pushed the largest scale mass incarceration of Muslims in China, Chinese citizens, Uyghurs in Xinjiang, who would have suppressed civil society to the extent that's being suppressed today, I also would have said, no way, not a chance. Yet here we are. And I think the challenge involves explaining both of these kinds of outcomes and making sense of both of these outcomes. I don't think the answer is that the first thing I described, all of this technology innovation and unbelievable ultramodernity, is explained by this kind of atavistic authoritarianism. I don't think that's the answer. And nor do I think that that kind of atavistic authoritarianism and strongman rule is somehow definitional. That's the thing that China is really about. What I want to do very briefly is turn back the clocks 100 years. So not next month, in May, we are going to be at a very important anniversary. May 4th, 1919, was a moment in Chinese history that, it was of course a student protest in Beijing, but it was a moment that was recognized then and certainly now by many Chinese as China's first modern moment, the beginning of the push to modernity. And so yes, there was a student protest, but there was this unbelievable intellectual renaissance that happened in the movement right around 1919 into 1920, 1921, and all kinds of ideas came into play, some from outside, some from China itself. So Marxism came into play, and Nietzschean nihilism came into play, and gender equality and sexual liberation, and Leninism and democracy and Deweyan pragmatism, all manner of ideas came into play. And I think what characterized that period, though, aside from this unbelievable experimentation, was a common sense of mission, a common sense of national mission. Not necessarily space program or technology, but a sense that Chinese society had entered a self-aware process of change, purposive change. And then in succeeding decades, we saw different answers to what that kind of self-aware process of change, of being something different from what we are today. We saw what that looked like. So we saw, I don't want to oversimplify, but I will anyway. We saw in the 1950s and 60s, a Maoist utopian answer. And that was about spiritual issues as much as material ones. It was about achieving the unthinkable and achieving things through the human will and achieving things through faith and building collectively. And it was about unbelievable catastrophe and unbelievable errors that occurred that cost millions of human lives. And it culminated in an unbelievable, I'm sorry to say, outflowing and paroxysm of violence. Not violence by Chinese against outsiders, but violence by Chinese against each other. And that period of utopianism was followed by something in the 1980s and 1990s and even the first decade of the 2000s that was, I think, even more radical and even more revolutionary, a different kind of remaking. Chinese society was remade. Well, in the term capitalism isn't used so much in China, but it was and is capitalism, a very radical and pretty fast exposure to markets, and a very radical, at least from the perspective of the ordinary Chinese citizen, a radical retreat of politics from day-to-day life, despite the, of course, persistence of authoritarianism. But markets everywhere for everything, education and healthcare and housing and job markets, which of course puts a lot of stress on people and makes them economically vulnerable, but at the same time affords a certain liberty in many respects of life. And I think during that period, we did see the bases for this kind of burgeoning of technology and technological solutions and burgeoning of human capital investment, the results of which we see today. And then not so long ago, maybe coincident with the rise of Xi Jinping, although not just about Xi Jinping, but the rise of Xi Jinping in late 2012, 2013, we saw a different kind of moment and a different kind of recreation that happens to mirror things going on in lots of the rest of the world, including in the United States. And that recreation seems to be about national identity expressed belligerently, often, national identity expressed through fear, often, national identity expressed through a big state and a heavy-handed state, and national identity expressed through the suppression of civil society and anybody who threatens, the state coming from civil society, be it an ethnic group or a civic group. I don't have an answer to why this is. I don't have an answer to why this is to some extent in a lot of parts of the world, including the US. I don't have an answer exactly to why it is in China, but I'll conclude really by making 2 points. The first is, since 1919, that May 4th movement, at least since 1919, China has been in this really self-aware, purposive experience of change. And what that experience has demonstrated is virtually anything is possible. That in this kind of recreation, we've seen, if I can say so for myself, nightmarish outcomes, and we've seen unbelievably exhilarating outcomes. And what you're seeing today isn't intrinsic, it's not definitional, and it's not the bottom line. It's not necessarily the end. We don't know where it's going, but we know from where it's been, there's plenty of room for experimentation and purposive experimentation. The second point, actually 3 points. The second point is that this is not an academic statement, but it's a personal impressionistic statement. I've always been amazed by my Chinese mentors and teachers the ability of many of my Chinese colleagues to simultaneously keep in their head diametrically opposite ideas. And what I don't mean by that is that they're contradictory, but the idea that one could be heading in one direction, but also maybe heading along a very different path simultaneously. Maybe it's yin yang. I don't want to trivialize this, but I've been raised in a society that's much more about orthodoxies. You have to get the property rights right if you want to get economic development. You have to have democratic institutions if you want democracy. That makes sense to me. But the ability to do things not totally in order and to keep these different ideas in one's head simultaneously, I think is worth looking at. And just the last thing truly that I'll say is the future is, of course, open-ended, but mainland China is not the only Chinese model that's in operation. There are other successors to the tradition of May 4th. They can be found in Taiwan, which also had its deep authoritarian and cataclysmic periods of history, but also a democratic one today. They can be found in Hong Kong and other parts of the Chinese diaspora. So I would urge us to think broadly about what the Chinese experience is and where it's headed. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Now let's hear from Rebecca.
So I'm going to talk a bit about China's scale. This is something that I've been thinking about both in my own individual work and in my collaborative work, some of which has happened as part of the program in Collaborative Humanities here at the Kogut Center, and some co-teaching that I've done with Tamara Chin in that program, so someone who's been part of this series earlier. And it's, when we think through this, part of it is trying to think about the opportunities offered by the scale of human, physical and human geography and China's chronology. And I'm glad, I appreciate Ed for introducing history, so I don't have to be the historian who brings up history as the first person on the path. Thank you. But this idea of scale, not merely as an object of study or an object of, say, marketing, which is something that's characterized the 20th century, going all the way back to at least as early as 1937, when the ad man, Shanghai-based ad man Carl Crow published the book 400 Million Customers, which has since been updated in many other iterations, and now we have 1.7 billion customers. And so it's not really just thinking of China as a scale, as an object to be looked at, but scale as agentive, or scale as foundational. How does the Chinese experience actually change the questions we ask or change our epistemologies? So I've been thinking about taking the scale of Chinese history, especially in this very fraught past 150 years that Ed has alluded to, seriously in two ways lately. One is in the individual research I've been working on to try to grasp the scope and impact of the human experience of war and displacement, separation, forced migration, colonialism during this time, both looking at China and Taiwan. And the second is thinking about how we can take this very painstaking work that many Chinese historians have been doing, both individual researchers and research groups, to uncover local stories and gather a great deal of local field work and local archives, and how we can actually scale up that knowledge to tell us bigger stories, either about China or about the world, and how to do that while sort of broaching a very stark digital divide. In essence, how we can deal with the Chinese internet and its implications for the digital humanities and our understanding of the digital world. So to start with this first issue, you may have heard the term China's century of humiliation, referring to this 100 years that starts with the Opium War and goes through usually through the founding of the People's Republic of China. This century characterized by the semi-colonial taking of China, but also China's invasion by foreign oppressors. And the sense within that, and that term is still used today, and it's been revived often by the Xi Jinping regime as a characterization of the painful recent history of China, and a history which is now being shed. And I think we need to take it seriously because it is based in harsh historical reality. It's also obviously a political term of art, but it is one that nonetheless has resonance with people. And that history itself is often incompletely dug up, ironically, sometimes because of local politics or Chinese governmental politics and global politics alike. So it's useful to think about that. What is missing from our global history regarding China, as well as from Chinese history itself? So many people are very anxious to see the history of their local histories, their local communities represented. And so we see WeChat history groups, we see amateur historians, we see wealthy entrepreneurs building private museums of the Cultural Revolution or of World War II history, gathering materials to contribute to this. And so my own work sort of intersects with some of these interests and then builds on them. And it looks at a sort of history of the Long War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, aka World War II, through the Chinese Civil War period and the early Cold War period, a time when as much as 1/4 of the Chinese population was displaced, up to 100 million people. And this is something we don't often hear in global histories of refugees. Yet, this is an enormous movement of the population, and with it, an enormous loss of life. So we have two silences that contribute to this. One is the silence in history writing itself and how refugees are counted and accounted for. And another is a silence, a personal silence and a family silence. Many of you will know maybe from your own families or from families that you know that this is a history that is often not recorded or not spoken of. And this is common to many communities who have undergone this traumatic experience of displacement and violence in the 20th century. So how can we account for this and account for silences? Thinking about the war, many of you may know pictures like this. The famous picture Bloody Sunday, termed Bloody Sunday, taken by a Shanghai-based photographer, depicting this child, which was seemingly left alone after a Japanese bombing in 1937 Shanghai. Those of you who may know a little bit more about the story know that he, in fact, was not alone. His father was nearby. And the full series of the photographs show him being rendered aid. But this is something about the image of China overall during this century that was being constructed by these photographs, but that continues on. This idea that that China is a place of orphans, it is a place of abjection, it is a place where children can be left alone and uncared for, is a place of suffering. If we look, where else can we look and get a sense of what what experience might be like? I've found it in things like wooden boats. Wooden boats after the end of World War II started carrying many passengers from the wartime capital of Chongqing back to places like Shanghai and Nanjing. These passengers were not alive. They were encoffined corpses who went back east before living refugees could, which showed the importance of reburial and care for the dead of many families and organizations in China during this time. Newspapers carried advertisements for these trips. And this was tied to the sense that dying away from home and outside of the family realm was a dispersal and separation of community and a breaking apart of the moral world. And that this was a strike against cosmological order as important as death itself. So these are the kinds of things that one has to search for carefully in the historical record because they may not be spoken of. And we see them spoken of perhaps only in the lines of short stories of people remembering, talking about Tomb Sweeping Day where there are no graves to sweep because the family members are lost. So this is the larger project. And along with it, I'll just mention very briefly the digital project, which is based on an idea that many digital humanities projects are built around a kind of one world concept, that eventually everything will be digitized and all we need are the tools to analyze it. We need better and better tools to analyze a growing and growing corpus. The world of Chinese digital objects is complex because of the Great Firewall, because of governmental restrictions. Sometimes things are digitized, but I can go to an archive and not walk away with the digital object itself. So just because something is digitized doesn't mean that it ends up as a digital object in the hands of researchers. Secondarily, there are many things that we work with as researchers that will never be digitized. So we're working now on this project, which is how to create a DOI, a digital object identifier, for something that may not exist in a digital realm, and to create a graph database that will allow us to share the records of those objects so that we know that that exists. We can share and collaborate on our knowledge of those objects, but we don't have to rely on everything being completely digitized. So we're hoping to foster greater collaboration and build up knowledge based on that. So that's it for me.
Okay, thank you. First, I would like to thank the university, Rick, and President Paxson and the Watson Institute for hosting this meeting. I thought it's a very timely meeting. Really, for me, I feel it's very important to communicate about the rise of China, especially the TV talk so much about. And as a Chinese origin, we live in a kind of how should I describe? Just say it's timely. I just say I want to borrow your sentence. You are opening up. I say 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, I came to this country. Before I came to this country, I was asking people who came to United States. I said, "What looks like a highway?" Because they never saw a highway. So I was imagining the highway was built so high, and it's like from the sky. Really, I recall so vividly, I was asking, what is a highway? But now you go back to China, now the highway was built to the most remote village, mountain area. And my hometown never see a train. But now the 350 kilometers per hour, the train was passed by 2 lines. So the rise of China, economy-wise, they really did a major progress. And I'm currently serving as the chief scientific advisor for China's National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. So I'm going to focus on the environmental issues related to China's development. So my question to everyone, to myself, is what can we learn from China's economic development and the public health and the human care? Can I move forward? This one? Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about China's economic development and the environmental deterioration. Okay. So I'll be very quickly to say that's really the China's economic development. So when we say rise of China, that's the rise of Chinese GDP during the past decade. You can see before 1990, it's almost not much change. But after China joined the WTO, that's how the pattern. Here I just showed you that the top is Shanghai in 1980s. 1990, and this is what a few years ago. Shanghai doesn't look like this anymore. There's many more high-rise buildings. So that indeed has a tremendous development. So I'm going to divide it into 3 periods for China rise and the public health. One is 1949 to 1979. That's so-called before the open door policy. There's really not much economic development. It's very slow, basically recover for surviving. So there's also very little environmental contamination. So that's that period. And then the second period is 1979 to 2009. That's the period when Deng Xiaoping visited the United States and met President Carter in 1979 in March and started the open door policy. Because he has a saying, who get along with America, who will be rich. So they started the economy. And the Chinese, the economy development, but at the same time, they pay very little attention to environment. And they pay very little attention to what's the consequence, this rapid economic development and the damage, potential damage to the land. You just see the land, 6 million, I taken from Chinese newspaper, 60 million acres of farmland with fertile farmland now it's totally polluted by metals. Yeah, 60 millions. That's I just say Chinese economic development paid a bigger price, the land and the people. So that's the land. You see the water, river after river is dead. And when we were young, everywhere you can go to catch fish. Yeah, you use a small basin, you can catch fish. And now like Yangtze River, Yellow River, it's not much fish anymore. So water. Air pollution, did you see? Yeah, this is a forbidden city, the right side, left side, both are forbidden city. But left side is many days a day, it looks like that. So it's not only just China produced this waste. China is the world's largest dumper, imported almost the majority of the world, United States, Europe's trash, for scrapping things. That's a year after year for 40 years. So you produce yourself and you import the trash, and this all is going to get to people. You see that's the hospital. Used to be the cancer hospital before I came to this country. The cancer hospital was like deserted. Now I go back to China, it's like a general hospital, full of people. Yeah, that's children's hospital. The birds is not enough, so they just put it into the front door. So there's really good people, uneasy. So that's the Chinese saying is restore my environment and restore my hometown. That's just very rare in China. You can do this because they really got a social instability. I can give you one real numbers. Do you know how many cardiovascular disease, stroke, and diabetes in China? It's 400 million diagnosed. That's more than what United States. Yeah, the total population. 400 million people with a stroke, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. Each year, the 1.2 million people premature death because of air pollution. So that's one side we're talking about rise of China. On the other side, we're talking about the price paid. Yeah. So because this situation, the Chinese government now they cannot ignore anymore. Yeah. So that's the third period. The China's from 2009 to current 2019. The Chinese government, president and premier finally called. Yeah, finally called. We need to fight against we need to fight for clean air. And so China now is the world's largest investor in green economy, renewable resources. On the top, that's China's. The highest is China's water power, solar power, and wind power. And this is also the China's, they invested in electric cars, and by 2025, China is going to have one-fifth of the car running on the street is going to be the electric cars, try to reduce the pollution, and also try to restore the forest. And China now, on this side, we're so hard for good R01 grants. Well, I just wanted to tell you the good news. I just got a $3 million grants to study metal exposure and diabetes in China. So, and yeah, well, I mean, while we are here, very tight budget, but China now, they invest billions dollars in research. So now we have, the past 5 years, I was helping China just finish one called Enhance study. It's a national environmental and nutrition study. This is the first one. Each year is a billions dollars. And this is another one called China's smog monitoring. It's 150 sites, and each site each year is like $1 million. So and there's many other studies with you and I, we went to the institute. And so I wanted to say that's the sites in China. We just finished this study. So my conclusion is we can see China, the economy rise. When you were very poor, 1949 to 1979, everyone wanted to be rich. Yeah. So by 1979, when Deng Xiaoping said, let's get rich, so everyone was trying to get rich. No one cared about the consequence. So now people's pocket seems a little bit full, and find out, wow, the poor time even better. So my point is, what lesson can we learn from China's economic rise and health come down? So because there's many developing countries, it's going to work in the same path. So that's my.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you can see why it's so exciting to be here. We had 4 amazing colleagues working in very different fields and shedding light, I think, in an interesting, more subtle, more sophisticated way about what's happening in China and its role in the global economy. Just to kick off the conversation, I thought I would ask a couple questions and then we'll open it up for discussion. So let me begin by talking about sort of advances in science, and this is to Jim, but to all of you. And I'm sorry, Jim, that I keep on having my back to you, but so, a number of you touched upon China's current ambitions to lead in science, to advance a space race, and to promote economic expansion. But given what several of you also mentioned, which is the current leadership style, which I think was described as traditional strongman, I guess my question is, can they really pull it off? What we know is that to make lasting and meaningful scientific advances, scientists usually need freedom to explore, to collaborate not just among themselves, but with global partners. Can China really achieve its scientific and economic ambitions, given what several of you have described as the current leadership style and environment? And Jim, maybe we could start with you and then ask others.
Yeah, I think it's a complex question. I think you're absolutely right that there are these issues, and my Chinese colleagues complain about them, about not being able to get more access to the internet in various different ways. But at the same time, I think the overarching aspect of the Communist Party, regardless of the leader, is not the kind of democracy that we think of when we think of our own interactions. And so there's sort of an umbrella under which most of the Chinese scientists operate, in which they kind of know the bounds, but there's actually a lot of, I won't say freedom per se, but just ability to interact internationally, to travel, to communicate with people like myself and others, to invite us to come visit them, and to collaborate in many different ways. So I think there is, I would say, kind of a network of interactions that we would not see on the face of it to be very different than what we see in the United States in terms of scientific meetings and organization and interaction. But at the same time, you have this larger scale um, uh, uh, cloud over you, if you will, of potential draconian measures. And I think basically a lot of Chinese already know how to operate under that. So I would just say, if you think about what President Xi came and congratulated the Chang'e 4 engineers and scientists, I mean, they know that it's a national priority, and if they basically stay out of politics, they're going to have a heck of a good career. So somewhere in there, it's a complex thing, and I think the draconian fist could come at any time. I can't predict how that would play out.
I agree. It's a complex issue. I think there are a lot of reasons to advocate for democracy and democratic society. I happen to think it's the right way to go. But I think it's a mistake to view democracy in instrumental terms or to project our own values onto other phenomena like innovation. And so I think innovation, a variety of kind, can happen in a variety of systems. Right now in China, in my view, the politics isn't good. But there's an unbelievable amount of data being generated by people using smartphones and apps like WeChat. There are an unbelievable number of engineers who've been trained at various levels. And that combination of engineers and data is being mobilized for lots of commercial innovation in AI, regardless of the politics. I think in the long run, it's important for any country to maintain stability. And it's important for talented people to feel that they have a future in the country. And when the politics starts impinging on those attitudes, then there's a problem. I don't think we've quite reached that yet.
Great. Anyone else want to add?
I'll just make a quick comment that I think it's quite interesting how if we take the internet, the idea of a closed internet in some way versus a completely open internet, that going back to Ed's earlier framing, that even 5 years ago, maybe we would have thought that China's internet was an outlier as a model, and that there was an assumption that that American internet or ideal of internet was going to be the only way to go. But now we know that there are many other imitators and growing numbers of imitators of China's model of internet. So I find that very instructive.
That's great. Let me ask a second question, which I think Tong and others raised, which was this kind of paradoxical situation. The graph that you showed about the incredible growth of China's economy from the 1980s on, and all of us know that this was probably one of the most dramatic periods of sort of poverty alleviation, of really taking millions and millions of people out of poverty and bringing them into 800 million people into out of poverty. But more recently, we've seen a lag, right? And a lag not just because of the consequences for public health and the environmental deterioration. We've seen a lag because of sort of a slowdown domestically in the market, and also a lag because of what's happening internationally, whether it's trade war or other demand, et cetera. So given that lag, what do you see as the prospects or at least some of these clouds that we're seeing in the prospects for the Chinese economy? What do you see as the consequence for the rise of China and its role in the global economy? Who wants to?
Good question, a big question. Just a few things. China right now it's an urban country. It wasn't several decades ago, but it's not a very urban country. About 60% of the population in China now lives in cities, relative to 80% in the countryside, really still in the 1970s, or 75% in the 1970s. But what that says is this is a country that at its current level of wealth has an inordinately low level of urbanization, which is also to say that the process of continued urbanization is going to continue to generate growth, I think, over the long run, and this shift into a consumption-oriented economy. But things have slowed a lot, and I think it's normal. It's normal to expect that the growth rates of the 1990s and early 2000s are not sustainable over the long run. That the adjustment to slower growth, I think, is a challenge socially and a challenge politically and a challenge economically, particularly because in recent years there's been so much speculation, particularly in things like real estate. And so slowdowns in the near term pose real problems.
Yeah, I just wonder about that because of the, it seemed like there was always this deal, which was that you would have economic prosperity in return for social stability. But now if the prosperity is kind of slowing down, we see, unemployment in certain industrial areas growing, we see rise of labor unrest. One of your pictures, Tong, was about environment, take back our community. So how is this going to play out with this system that seems to be so tightly tied to economic development? Jim, did you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I was just thinking a little bit of a variation on that theme that I noticed is that, the family is so important in China, and yet this economic development is driving huge numbers of people to the cities and breaking up families. That is to say, one family member, a parent, will go and leave the children in the village. I saw tons of partly built villages, which, basically people were fleeing. And I wonder what effect, essentially, what it appears to be a disintegration of a lot of families has to do with the social stability and the economy as well. I'm wondering if anybody, I don't have any perspective on that, just observations.
GDP increase each year, and then people say if we're less than 9%, China is going to have a bigger trouble. And then they reach the 9%. And then people say 7% will be the lowest bottom line at the reach the 7%. Now it's about this year 6.5%. And the next year, the anticipated just finished the Chinese government meeting is going to be 6% predicted. But China, because like the United States, it's such a huge economy with 13,000 trillions dollars GDP per year. So China's they emphasize the international trading has some impact to China's economy. There's no doubt. Just like the discussion with the United States trading, if you totally stop the trading between United States and China, is about 1% the impact. So they're not going to really hurt China much with the 13,000 trillions GDP per year. So the China, what they are doing is trying to emphasize, that's what they plan to do, to emphasize the stability, the progress with a continually privatization. And but at the same time, because that's what my discipline, I have to go back to where I'm talking about. They realize if you just keep going, don't care any consequence, just care about the GDP, they can continue to go back to 10%. There's no problem. China's this GDP come down in many, many sense. It's voluntarily cut. Like as far as I know, in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Canton, and they shut down hundreds of thousands of polluting industries. This kind of small industry with a tremendous environmental damage and the cost, the material damage, they just shut down. So China actually now, in part of the economic slowdown, is put the attention to the environmental issues, put it to the health issues.
Great, thanks. Let me ask one last question, and maybe Rebecca can kick us off on this. So we're on a college campus, and college campuses have waves of student protest. And several of you mentioned that, from the May 4th movement to Tiananmen Square, China has also a history of student protest. So what's the mood of students on campuses today? And how are youth viewing things like trade wars, space race, issues of climate change, and access to information? Is this striking a nerve or not?
That's a good question. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think there's been a sort of theme in some of the comments about the intersection of the image of, or the resonance of some of the message of pride in the political discourse, and then other critiques and so on, because I think that there is a real sense among some students of I guess a feeling of that, really, like, that now this is the moment where, particularly given the political situation in the United States, the withdrawal of the United States um, from its previously stated global leadership positions, that this is the time when China is actually meant to take its place it's a long delayed place on the global stage. So there's for some students, there's considerable support for that. For other students, I think that there's going to be continued, at least, questioning, particularly if there's, and I would imagine it might be quite regional too. I was thinking in our previous discussion that a lot of the feeling of economic pressures, particularly job pressures for students, is going to be regional. We've seen this already there have been some scandals about college admissions, about the strength of newly developed universities who have jumped up their rankings and then not been able to kind of follow through for their students. There have been college entrance examination testing scandals. So
Unusual.
yes, exactly. No, we never hear that here. But as you know, so these kinds of things, I think, are very keenly felt, and social inequality is still very keenly felt. So I would think that those kinds of things will emerge, and maybe not on a sort of macro, multi-campus protest level, but you see it on social media, for
Great.
example.
Excellent. Ed, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, if I could. So I'm not in a position to generalize, I guess, but I will anyway. Sorry. I completely agree with Rebecca that students, at least in my experience relative to the past, are much more patriotic, I would say. Not necessarily nationalistic, but patriotic and proud of their country's achievement. And they're much more part of the establishment than they used to be. I mean, party membership is very high in elite universities. And I think that's for a lot of reasons. And a lot of it has to do with just material reasons, getting ahead in society. So, but just the other thing I want to say is, maybe not unlike here, students in China, they're facing a lot of uncertainties and vulnerabilities, climate change and international competition, and then the dark side of the internet. I mean, think about the filth that, out of New Zealand just a few days ago, the abominations that were spread across the internet. Now, I'm all for an open internet, but one could see how somebody would look at that and say, oh, the government has a role in stopping that stuff, putting an end to it. And there's I think, a receptive audience in China to that, because it's a society that's much more comfortable with or accustomed to a big state, perhaps, than this one is. And that's simply to say that if you try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, I think you could tell a narrative for why college students at the moment in China aren't up in arms, and a narrative that goes beyond simply the government is suppressing them. Although I think the students also know that if they were out protesting, there would be a harsh response.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Why don't we open it up to the public, and if you have questions, and if you do, if you could, we have microphones. If you could please line up behind the microphone and introduce yourself, and we could start. So if you want to move to are we going to have people move to the aisles, or can we hand them? All right, so let's pass them. If people can just introduce themselves. There's a question. Okay.
My name is Linda Jenkins, and you've been talking, this is particularly for Dr. Head. You've been talking about collaboration and cooperation, and my question is about Space Force. It's about defense and what with Taiwan and the opposite side of collaboration and cooperation. And are you interested or are you involved in the Space Force in any way?
Categorically, no. The Space Force, I think, is something that is a dream of President Trump's, and I think that if you saw the pushback from the military initially and a lot of Congress, you understand that it may or may not be a good idea and is really not well developed at the present time. It's going to be argued out in Congress a lot. I think that the Chinese government is already making propaganda of that. President Xi has pointed out that, okay, America is doing a space force, we're doing peaceful exploration of the cosmos and engaging all international countries, et cetera. So it is a bit of a political deal. Make no mistake that space is the defense frontier. Indeed, if one does not have a presence in space, you do so at your own peril, because indeed that can, we can shut down virtually all communications with the appropriate instruments in space, and that's a real danger for everybody. So the short answer is, I think, at least from my perspective, international cooperation in science and exploration really lays a bottom-up foundation for collaboration. This is exactly what we did with the Soviet Union and the Russians, and it worked beautifully. Right now, there's a number of people in Earth orbit who've been there for, we've been in Earth orbit for years. And in fact, it's Russians, Americans, Canadians, all sorts of international partners. And I think as much as we yell at each other with the Russians back and forth, nonetheless, when push comes to shove, we're working together in space. And I think that works to essentially keep a lid on the uber rhetoric and helps to lay a foundation for cooperation. So as scientists, we get a lot out of that. It isn't a one-way street at all. Landing on the far side of the moon, the details that they're finding, we're working with them on those, they're really amazing. So I think the essentially bottom-up collaboration is a hopeful foundation for more peaceful interaction.
Thanks, Jim. We had another question over here. Yeah.
My name is Dor Levy. I'm from the Department of Comparative Literature, and even though I work on traditional China, I have always maintained a great interest in modernization and especially the demography of China. So one thing I would like to throw into the mix that hasn't been mentioned is that unfortunately the process of or possibilities of sex selection before birth have hit China and India particularly strongly, and unfortunately the processes are neither so expensive nor so disgraceful as to keep people from aborting females and keeping males, so that the ratios of live male births to female births have jumped in the direction of something like 115 to 100. And as we face possibilities or potential areas of social unrest, this is one that is very likely to come back and create a certain amount of problems. I can't remember the date, something like 2030. By 2030, there will be a bulge of males of marriageable age of about 30 million. Please correct me if I'm wrong. That's the population of Canada. And so it's not just student unrest in universities and movement to the cities, although that's been very radical, but there is this underlying issue with the fall of the birth rate and the rise of this ratio that is likely to create certain issues further down the line.
Great. Thank you. Anyone want to respond to that?
There's a male-female ratio. Indeed, it exists in China. Mainly came from the one-child policy. And because from 1970s until like 3 years ago, each couple, you can only have one child. These are only for the Han nationality, not for the minority like Tibet or they're fine. They can have as many baby as possible. But now they changed the policy because of aging problem, because there's a male-female ratio difference. So then the government realized this problem. So now they allow you to have 2 babies. I think they will gradually change the time, the problem. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, David Burbach. I teach at the Naval War College down in Newport. And actually, sort of following on from Professor Head's comments about space cooperation, more generally, you probably know this, our current administration is taking a more competitive line with China, I guess you could say, and raising a number of issues about how entwined our technological base is becoming with China. And specific to universities, frankly, a lot of interest in reducing the number of Chinese students in the U.S., concern about whether Chinese graduate students might be stealing technology and intellectual property. Some of that relates to the specific sort of anti-immigration stance of the current White House, but it is much broader than that. When I tell my military officers about the percentages of grad students in the U.S. who are Chinese nationals, I mean, their eyes get very wide. They find it very surprising. So what I would ask is, first, I guess a softball, what would you be telling officials in D.C. about why it's good to have so much interaction? I'm also curious about the Chinese perspective. The Soviets were extremely cautious about letting their people go study abroad. The Chinese government seems to feel very confident that they're not taking a political risk by having so many students go abroad and then come back after exposure to Western countries.
So who would like to address that?
I could start if you wish. Okay, so I think it's very complicated, and let me say up front that one of the reasons we're so successful in collaborating with our Chinese colleagues is because we do not develop work in developing military technology. So basically, we're talking about acquisition of images, which are pretty standard types of things, and we end up doing image analyses on these, which are not so complex that they're in the defense realm at all. So we're really fortunate to be able to interact. So we analyze samples and blah, blah, blah. But and we found that, in fact, when the Chinese students come, and many of them do, of course, they're studying in our lab right now, as well as many other places in university, that they really have a lot to offer. They actually really are extremely motivating to our students. And not only that, they're very anxious to learn just the history of space exploration and the techniques of space exploration. This is not high technology. It's just simply, how did you manage to design what do you do when you get to the moon? What are the big problems, scientific problems, etc.? This is not new technology at all. On the other hand, it is very clear that one has to be very wary of technological theft, if you will, intellectual theft and so on. It's very real. Quite frankly, I hope we're doing as good a job, and I'm sure we are, as the Chinese are doing. So I don't doubt that. It's not a wishful thinking kind of thing. It's a very much of a reality. I think the key here is that a lot of reasons that Chinese students are permitted by the government to come is because, as getting back to an earlier question, we have a lot of respect in the student population for what's going on. If you were a student in China, the students that I hang out with in China and that come to the U.S., they hang on the next announcement of the party Congress about what the major priorities are, because that's what defines their career. And so we were over there when the party came out with the next stage in the lunar exploration program. Everybody was cheering. We were really behind this, and they find it extremely motivating. And I would just say too that one last thing is that one of my very dear colleagues in China, who's Wei Mingbao, he told me that basically we sit down and we have these long conversations. He says, Jim, the Chinese are tired of being America's factory, okay? We really want to, in fact, contribute to humanity. We want to develop ideas. And right now, essentially, developing creative ideas within China is the coin of the realm. That's not just in making money, but it's also in scientific advancements and solar system exploration and so on. So I think that's a huge component of it too, that they're not afraid, oh my gosh, once they see New York City, we're never going to come back again. That's not the case at all. In fact, they're very pleased to go back. And I think they learn. They do learn from us, but we learn from them as well. And in my area, at least, it's a really good, fair exchange.
Want to add to that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think I'm picking up in a slightly different register that last comment about China being the world's factory or America's factory. I can think of it in intellectual terms too, as thinking about the evolution even of my own field from when I started as a graduate student, when from people being trained in Chinese history, the study of Chinese history outside the U.S., consuming secondary works created largely by people trained outside the U.S., writing not in Chinese, going to China and consuming the raw materials that resided there. And now that, 20, 30 years later, that is a completely different world. And of course, there were people who were way ahead of that at the time, but that was the by and large the framework. And now there's more of a true collaboration in that people travel back and forth, and we share materials and ideas, and students spend time from the respective programs, spend time in the various places. So it's not merely scholars from the outside coming and consuming the materials and going away, but also we're thinking about how to share our materials creatively across collected from different places. And one of the things that the Chinese government created that some of you may be familiar with because you get inquiries is this Century Scholar program, where people who are graduate students want to spend a year abroad, but then Chinese academics who are in academic university positions in China have to often spend a semester or a year abroad in order to gain promotion. And for some people, that makes perfect sense. And for some people, sometimes it's a bit of a leap because it may not make absolute sense for their particular program at the moment, their program of study. But it has overall just been a sort of wonderful font of exchange and information. So would that the United States government gave us all, a year's funding to go spend, spend time in another country as part of our promotion package. That would be great,
And let me just piggyback on where Rebecca said, and I just how Brown sees this, because that was part of the question, which is we are an open university. We are a global university. We welcome the best and brightest from everywhere. That's our policy, and that is a policy that we communicate very clearly, even with government officials when they ask, "What about this country? And are you concerned?" and stuff like that. So that's our policy, and I think that we believe that it enriches us. That, as Rebecca said, there is this sort of circulation of ideas and peoples and possibilities, et cetera. There was this wonderful book written by Annalise Saxenian, a Brown parent, called The New Argonauts, and it was all about Silicon Valley. And 1/3 of all startups in Silicon Valley come from immigrant entrepreneurs who are coming from China and India primarily. So one of the most dynamic parts of the American economy is benefiting from the circulation, and that's our policy, is to encourage it. Yeah, Chris.
Chris Rose, I'm in engineering, and this is generated at everybody or directed at everybody. I'm a Sputnik baby, so I was born the year Sputnik went up. So in a selfish sort of government grant sort of way, do you think that in the same way that Sputnik spurred technological development, STEM education, and everything else that went along with it, is that going to be a path forward, or is there some other path forward that you see?
Who wants to get?
A path forward for what? For China or for the U.S.?
I'm thinking mainly in terms of U.S. policy or Western policy and in investment in science and technology.
I could. No, go ahead.
Well, right now we've generally societally have moved increasingly to positioning China as an adversary. And I think that kind of adversarial positioning does encourage investments in a number of areas, like big carrier battle groups and, strike fighters. And but also, I think science and technology, maybe education, but certainly science and technology. There may be some benefits to that kind of positioning, but I don't think that the defensive crouch and the zero-sum approach is certainly not the only way. The Europeans, we could see it on the Huawei case, are already distancing themselves from the U.S. position and trying to position themselves as a more intermediary between North America and China, or at least as an alternative to the direct confrontational path. And I'll just say again that I think it's fine to have an adversary and fine to use some kind of external threat to encourage STEM education, but there are plenty of common threats that we face that could also be used to stimulate STEM education. So we don't really know exactly how AI can be used in a positive way as opposed to weaponized. I think, I'm not a scientist, I haven't fully figured out how advances in genetic engineering and bioengineering are really going to be used to our benefit rather than weaponized. And we haven't figured out how really to address climate change. So I think there could be ways, recognizing that there's going to be competition, there could be ways to move off a wholly adversarial positioning.
I could comment on that too, if you wish. So I think, Chris, it's a really great question. I think, that this underlines the difference between the Chinese system and democracy. Democracy is really messy, and until it's threatened, it tends not to respond too much. You're a Sputnik baby. I was a Sputnik graduate student, and my education was paid for by the National Defense Education Act. Every time I go to Russia and hang out with my Russian colleagues, I toast them with vodka. Thanks for my education. We really appreciate it. China, on the other hand, in 1986, as part of the seventh five-year plan, had Project 863, which was to essentially underwrite huge amounts of money that were outside the budget for technology development. That was one of the things that really got things going. We can't do that. It's not so easy. Take a look at the budget today. Science is under attack. Democracy is really messy. So I think one thing is that it depends on the system. We managed to do it as a response to Sputnik. On the other hand, the Chinese in 1986 made a huge investment, extra budget-wise, like all kinds of money for this outside the budget to develop technology. So it's hard to see where it's going to go.
Last questions, yes.
Yes, I'm David London. I'm not an academic, just a proud alum. The discussion in the last few minutes has revolved around collaboration and sharing, and the word you termed of confrontation. This is a panel of academics, and the history of academia has always been collaboration and sharing. But if this were a panel of business people from American corporations, not a week goes by that there isn't a disclosure of bribery for scientific and technological secrets from China and a few other countries as well, but mostly from China. Someone being indicted, someone being arrested, someone being discovered and charged every single week in the business press, whether it's high tech or it's industrial stuff. It's nonstop, and it seems to get bigger and bigger. Could you put yourselves, just any one of you, put yourselves in the shoes of someone whose company is suffering from cyber attacks and from trusted employees finding out they've been bribed to deliver secrets of their company's skills or technologies to China?
Great. What I'm going to do is collect a couple questions and then turn it to the panel. I think there was a question over here.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm a graduate student in economics, and I have a history question. So I think you alluded to this, Rebecca, that there are private museums opening up that's maybe widening the discussion of China's more problematic past. Do you think that the slipping in of information from the outside world, firewall, the Great Firewall side, do you think that there is a path forward for China to slowly reckon with its past, or do you think that the government is going to shut these channels down.
Okay. And I saw a question back there.
Thank you. My name is Zach Laporta. I'm a graduate student in computer science here at Brown. Between 2013 and 2014, I was fortunate enough to be able to spend about 6 months in China studying and living there. I was in Suzhou and Shanghai. And so my question relates to the continuity of China's government today with its with ancient forms of government, the traditional dynasty model. And my question is sort of motivated by an anecdote I have when I was studying I was just studying for an exam in a common room at the university I was at in Suzhou, and there were a few Chinese students that sat down next to me, and I asked them what they were studying for, and they said that they were studying for the Communist Party entrance exam, or one of the entrance exams that they would have to take, and that made me step back and realize that although as an American it's very easy to consider foreign, models of government as either democracy or tyranny, it did seem to me in that moment that, okay, there is this gray area in between where you do have participation of the general populace in a more authoritarian government, but still one that the people have access to if they try to gain access to it. So my question is, do you view in that sense the government of China today as more similar to the bureaucratic models of ancient China where people could also take exams to participate? And do you view the government and bureaucracy of China today as an evolving form which has staying power far into the future?
Okay, great. And I think I saw one last hand actually back there, and then we're going to get a round of answers. Yeah.
My name is Mu Chun. I'm a Chinese graduate student. So I find the last question, what lesson can we learn from China's experience, is pretty intriguing because in my experience, we in China always say we are following the developing pathway of other developing countries. So although we now have, we learn from the primary school is first pollution, second remediation. If I remember right, so Europe and US also in the last century also have very serious pollution problem. Even now, the Rhode Island state also is one of the pollution site of the heavy metal in drinking water and volatile organic compounds in soil. So what we actually anticipate is when you look at our development, actually China is looking for the future of the developed countries to anticipate its future. So after decades, you think people can customize their development pathways. Actually, it's not. So there's many things during the development falls into a hysterical inevitability. So it's like the development pathway is actually dodging the budget, dodging the bullets, and actually they all look the same. So my question is, let aside the dark history and developing speed, what's the difference between the rise of China with the rise of US and the rise of Japan and other countries?
Excellent. Thank you. Why don't we start? You can pick and choose whatever questions you want to answer, starting with Rebecca and then cutting across.
So just to talk about the question of history that's done, say, by individuals or small groups outside of an academic setting, we'll put it that way. That's been going on for a while, including these museums. Some of these museums have opened and been shut already. And the interesting thing is, I think a lot of that actually doesn't have an awful lot to do with developments outside of China necessarily. That some of that does come from this very deep interest in wanting to uncover the details of recent history, and some of it just comes from the ability, of the financial ability of some of these recent entrepreneurs to fund it. So China's own rise is in a way funding the ability to uncover the history of that rise. But some of it is uncomfortable for the government. partly because of the history itself, but maybe partly because these are unsanctioned. Unsanctioned institutions. So we might be able to fit them into also a history just of unsanctioned institutions rise and fall, such as so-called house churches or other kinds of local religious groups and so on and so forth, trade unions, etc. And then the other thing about history is that one could look into a lot of the developments of how people think about examination and think about political participation. Though I guess the one comment I would make on that is it's always important to think about, to look at the granular history of the past, of the recent past, in which in China would be like a couple hundred years, if we talk about recent past, but also like what are the claims that people are making about the continuity of the ancient past with the present, and why are they making those claims? Because we see them happen a lot. These claims of a very long continuity, and there's always often a kind of instrumentality behind those claims.
Ed?
To David's question, I suppose one interpretation of what was said today is there are a bunch of academics and we're kind of into collaboration.
We're not really, but that's
yeah.
at least
well, not with each other, but conceptually. But you know, like we've said about a lot of things, the empirical world is complex. So there's definitely been theft in China, commercial theft, Chinese companies stealing from each other, stealing from abroad. And there's been, I think, government-supported espionage and theft. At the same time, you have a bunch of multinational companies, some big, some small, that are capturing tremendous value in China, whether it's Google or Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Cloud Services that are there partly for the market and partly for the talent. In 2012, when I was living in China, when the Snowden affair broke open, you know, a lot of my friends, Chinese friends, looked at that and were just in shock that all of this technology, all these Cisco systems and IBM systems that were all over the place in China's infrastructure may be windows for espionage. Whether they were or not, who knows? But it's interesting that it gets to the issue of China's model. One difference between China's development model and Japan's and South Korea's is that from early on, the Chinese development model was very open to FDI, foreign direct investment. It was very open to foreign companies coming in and selling goods and also buying companies. Now, maybe that was a strategy and an effort to get information, but it also provided outsiders with a place in the Chinese system that is problematic from that side, as well as for the reasons you mentioned. And just the last point about leadership and some of the images and historical images, my mind still is, my head's spinning, really, when I think about Xi Jinping, the head of state, chairman of the Communist Party, reaching back to Chinese high antiquity to celebrate China's national revival, the great revival of the Chinese people, pointing back to Chinese high antiquity and sending money into linguistics and history. I like the money going in there, but Chinese high antiquity was supposed to be what the Chinese Revolution was against. That the Chinese government today officially has as its main outreach arm for, language promotion, the Confucius Institute. It wasn't so long ago when Chinese were struggling against Confucius. I don't say that mockingly, because God knows in this country we also do funny things historically, but rather to say, again, the plasticity, the flexibility, the ability to take a past and completely recreate it into something different. To me, it looks a little more like Chiang Kai-shek than Mao Zedong, but it doesn't matter what my interpretation is. This flexibility is jaw-dropping and extraordinary, and it could give us some pause for horror, but I think it actually gives us a lot of cause and reason for hope.
Tom?
Okay. I just say, first I wanted to have a response to the hundreds of thousands of Chinese students come to this country to study. I just wanted to say China is hungry for science and for technology, because in 1949, in the 1950s, China cannot even produce matches. So that's why China in order to development the land, and also from I personally benefited when I got a scholarship from Harvard in 1980s, and I appreciated the Americans supported me and training me where I am today, and also the soft power. We should recognize the soft power the United States has. China has today, even though we don't consider it an open society, but even to this level, the tremendous influence from the people trained here go back to China. The influence, I know like President Paxson went to China a few years ago, give a speech in Tsinghua, and your speech is spread all over China, the universities. And I went to West China, Lanzhou University, and I went to Wuhan University. Everyone has your copy. And so I just see the power we have here, and not just to training Chinese science. And these people return to China. Science is a treasure for the human being. And we don't want to keep a society as slaves forever. But it's help each other in one sense. And another sense is the influence to the society. And I want to respond to my countryman's comments about what lesson we learn from China. That's exactly my point. When the Great Britain, when they developed it, they went through the same path. That's why the 1950s, 1952, they have a horrible air pollution called London smog. To what level? When you raise your hand, you cannot see your finger. When you bend your head, you cannot see your toenail. So that's what I experienced for the industrialization, modernization in Europe. In the United States, this country also experienced, that's why Los Angeles smog and all these kind of pollution issues. So my point is, why China? How? For what reason? We did not learn from the experience from Great Britain, from United States. And for the future countries which are developing, like India, India is going to repeat China, what China did. So China now do not own the world's worst city, polluted city. Now it's India. So India's GDP is going to increase. It's past China. Their air pollution, their water pollution, soil pollution is going to pass China. So how can we use China's experience to learn to benefit to everyone? That's my point.
Great. And Jim, you have the last word.
Okay. So I think to the Brown graduate who is worried about industrial espionage, this is a very, very significant problem. I hark back to what Albert Einstein is purported to have said at the advent of the nuclear age. Everything has changed but our way of thinking. And indeed, the ability to utilize the internet to do industrial espionage along with a lot of other things is critical. And I guess my one statement is we have to just remain vigilant, okay, because it is a way of life now. So we need to protect against that. The second point is that I think, when we talk about the students and the young people, it's interesting and the exchanges, okay? I find in my lab when people come, they learn a lot from us. They learn a lot about freedom and democracy. They learn a lot about different types of systems. We learn a lot about not demonizing people that don't happen to agree with exactly what democracy is, whatever it is in our day-to-day. And I think, for example, they see when they come here for the first time the videos of Tiananmen Square for the first time, okay? And in addition to that, for example, one of the students told me that her friend mentioned when President Xi declared that he was president for life, basically, or got that through the system. A friend of hers shared on WeChat, I'm not sure that's a really good idea. Within a day, he was, as she said, invited to come down to the police station to explain what he meant and to be told in no uncertain terms, don't get involved with that. So that's there is this problem. There's two parts of this problem. And I would say the other thing is that we need to get perspective on our own country. With the comments that you just heard just previously, climate change is under attack now. Pollution is going to be more unabated than it has been in the past. And, it's happening in our own country. We are actually, I think, taking a step backward. and we need to be vigilant about that. And finally, I would say I'd love to come down to the War College to talk to your military colleagues about what's going on in China as well. So you have my coordinates, so please get in touch. Thanks very much, Rick.
So please join me in thanking this wonderful group of panelists. There is a reception outside, so please continue the conversation in a more informal way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, that was great. That was really excellent. Excellent. That was great.